There was a new UAP hearing recently at the U.S. Senate. AARO Director Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick testified about the activities of his All-Anomaly Resolution Office at the Pentagon. What have we learned about this, and how is this being perceived internationally? This is what we're going to talk about in this show. Joining me now are two distinguished guests, Dr. Erman Ansbro and Paolo Guizzardi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ansbro, you are an astronomer. You're a distinguished member of the SETI community. You're a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, among others. And you are also Ireland's representative for the International Coalition of Extraterrestrial Research. And Paolo, you have a background in electronic engineering. You have worked for the Italian embassy in Berlin. You are a member of the Centro Ufologico Nazionale, and you are Italy's representative in ICER. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, I'm sure you have both followed the hearing that recently took place at the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services, or more precisely, the subcommittee of this, which is the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities. This is the chairwoman of that subcommittee, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who has been advocating transparency in terms of UFOs for quite some time. And I must say, while I didn't have a lot of expectations about this hearing, my expectations were actually, I would say, I was really excited to hear some of the things that we heard. What are your takes on this? Paolo, maybe we start with you.
Okay. Thanks, Robert. Well, I heard many negative voices, many who felt disappointed by this lack of, how can I say, of, I don't know, admission, very likely. But I mean, there are things that needs to be considered. First of all, Dr. Kirkpatrick has released for the record a declaration, which now I am quoting because I think it is important. He says, quote, "I should also state clearly for the record that in our research, AARO has found no credible evidence thus far of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics."
Yes, exactly. And before we go into that, let me show you, let us see the clip where he says that and what the Senator Gillibrand says. Let's have a look.
We learned that there was strong evidence of advanced technology reflected in the features and performance characteristics of many objects observed by our highly trained service members operating top-of-the-line military equipment. We learned that for the past 8 years, military pilots frequently encountered unknown objects in controlled airspace off both the east and west coasts across the continental United States in test and training areas and ranges. We don't know where they come from, who made them, or how they operate. As former Deputy Secretary of Defense David Norquist observed, had any of these objects had the label "Made in China," there would be an uproar in the government and media.
Meanwhile, for the few cases in all domains, space, air, and sea, that do demonstrate potentially anomalous characteristics, AARO exists to help the DoD, IC, and interagency resolve those anomalous cases. In doing so, AARO is approaching these cases with the highest level of objectivity and analytic rigor. This includes physically testing and employing modeling and simulation to validate our analyses and underlying theories, then peer reviewing those results within the U.S. government, industry partners, and appropriately cleared academic institutions before reaching any conclusions. I should also state clearly for the record that in our research, AARO has found no credible evidence thus far of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics.
Now that's interesting to me. It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Senator Gillibrand says these are advanced. What did she say? Advanced vehicles that advanced technology that are observed in by highly trained service members. We don't know where they are from, who made them, or how they operate. And then Dr. Kirkpatrick says he has found no credible evidence of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics. Isn't that a contradiction, Dr. Ansbro? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Robert. There is a contradiction here, and it's surprising actually that they're not making progress to do with the physics behind the technology. I'm sure there has been a lot of data to analyze by some of the team in AARO and other associated groups dealing with AARO. There's still a problem there of even, how shall I put it, accepting that we are dealing with possible different categories here. It doesn't necessarily mean it's extraterrestrial. It could be here, the particular intelligence could be here actually, even before we arrived on the scene, so to speak. And it's also possible, which I would eliminate anyway, dealing with black operations from either Russia, China, or even the United States. It's all down to analyzing the data. And this is where I will be coming from. It's an astrophysical approach. But unfortunately, the problem is that the physics that we're trying to apply to understanding this doesn't seem to be working. So we do have a dichotomy here. I'll leave it at that point in time. You know.
I mean, that's a valid point that you're addressing there, because he underlines the importance of peer reviewing those results with the U.S. government, industry partners, and appropriately cleared academic institutions before reaching any conclusion. Now, you are a scientist. May I ask you, how would you scientifically prove that something that you observe for the first time is extraterrestrial?
Well, it doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial. You cannot assume it's extraterrestrial. I think that's probably a perception or a worldview that's been conditioned in society when something is completely unknown. I think you have to deal with different categories here, which will include extraterrestrial, of course.
I agree, but I perfectly agree with you. I'm just wondering, how would this scientific proof look like? Wouldn't you need something like a blueprint to know what an extraterrestrial thing looks like before you can relate an observation to that in order to prove that it's...
No, indeed not. Because how do you define an extraterrestrial? How do you define the technology behind an extraterrestrial situation? Okay, you can only speculate, it is acceptable to speculate based on a foundation, but we don't have a foundation for this at the present time.
Yeah. Paolo, what do you think?
It all boils down to the old matter or the old subject of scientific proof. Science, as it's made today, as we know it, require scientific proof, which is acquired through the application of a scientific method. And that's fine. But first of all, we have to remember that the UAP phenomenon has this very peculiar characteristic of being elusive. It looks like it's a phenomenon which does not want to be studied, if I can use this term, first of all. So the matter is exactly this. How can we reconcile the necessity of science to confirm the authenticity of a certain phenomenon? How can we reconcile this with what we have available in the concerning the UAP phenomenon? So, I mean, Dr. Kirkpatrick was blamed by many for his how can I say, lack of explosive declarations, maybe. But I mean, I do understand him because he has pledged many times, and he made very clear that he will be following, so we will be studying the subject, applying strictly the scientific method. His office will study the subject, seeking the cooperation, interagency cooperation with the industrial world, with the academy, with scientific world in general. So, I mean, this is to be commended because we have never seen anything like this before. But in any case, this has its own limits because it's not Dr. Kirkpatrick to be blamed in my vision, but it's the scientific method in itself. Does it lend to properly to study a very peculiar subject as is the UAP phenomenon? Question mark. I would say not completely. Either not at all, no, this is not the case. But it, in my opinion, it does not lend itself completely to the study of such a peculiar, specific, unique phenomenon as it is the phenomenon of UAP.
Do you agree, Dr. Ansbro?
I do agree.
Yeah. Now, Christopher Mellon, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, he watched that hearing closely as well. And he had the following remark on Dr. Kirkpatrick's statements. He said, unlike Dr. Kirkpatrick, I find the testimony of U.S. military personnel in the Nimitz case perfectly credible evidence of aeronautical technology that defies our present understanding. It is not proof of ET, but it is certainly credible and remains unexplained. And if you remember the first hearing, you had Ronald Moultrie and Scott Bray testifying at the committee, and they were asked, can you name that one specific case where you think this could be potentially extraterrestrial? And they said, well, there is the Nimitz case. We have sensor data on that, and this simply remains unexplained. So this also to me looks like a contradiction. Dr. Kirkpatrick says we have no credible evidence thus far of objects that defy the known laws of physics. But what about that Nimitz case where Alex N. Dietrich, the fighter jet pilot, described these things zipping around like a ping pong ball shortly above sea level? And she said, how could we ever fight this? How could we ever go in combat with this? I mean, isn't that a contradiction? I'm not going to the extraterrestrial hypothesis here because I perfectly agree with both of you that this is just one of many hypotheses. But I mean, what kind of technology is that?
If I may,
yeah,
Robert.
Yes.
I would like to underline the credible evidence. So what is credible evidence for a scientist? A scientist will want to follow strictly the scientific method. So there is no credible evidence in the sense that there is no tic-tac that have been captured and which underwent technical analysis, blah, blah, blah. It's just the declaration of the witnesses. So, I mean, again, there we go again. The scientific method needs hard data, so to speak. And here we do not have, of course, I mean, we have the declaration of the pilots. We have, but also in this case, we have instrumental data from various sensor platforms, which is important. But there again, we are again at the same point. The scientific method needs a specific set of data, and we do not have this specific set of data even in this case. So, I mean, in my opinion, it is necessary to, in any case, adopt, if it's possible. I mean, I know it's not easy to find I would say a scientific method 2.0, so to speak, a sort of expanded scientific method which could accommodate also this kind of phenomena. And if I may, Robert, I would go back again to the declaration for the record of Dr. Kirkpatrick, and he said I quote, in the event of sufficient scientific data, wherever obtained, that the UAP encountered can only be explained by extraterrestrial origin, we are committed to working with our interagency partners at NASA to appropriately inform the US government's leadership of its finding. So, I would like to bring to the critics' attention the matter that just say 5 years ago, it would not have been possible to have this kind of statements by a person at that level. I mean, in the event sufficient scientific data wherever obtained that the UAP encounter can only be explained by ET origin, we are committed to working to appropriately inform the US government. I mean, let us think properly on this, gentlemen. 5 years before, 5 years ago, would not have been possible to hear this kind of statement from a person at that level. Not at all. So, I mean, it's in more general terms, the search for the truth on the UAP phenomenon is going on, but very, very slowly. And again, also, I would like to remind to the criticists of Dr. Kirkpatrick that he has stated very clearly that in case they have enough scientific data to whereby only the ET hypothesis would explain a given UAP case, he will not, repeat, not inform the public. The AARO office will work with NASA to inform the US government leadership. And so so let us not expect anything really new, anything explosive directly from AARO.
Since
it's normal.
Since you were talking about scientific data, let me just show you what Professor Gary Nolan from Stanford University said about the UAP hearing. And this is a direct response to Christopher Mellon's tweet that I showed earlier. He says, anecdotal evidence by credible witnesses, especially when they describe similar observations, is data. Some of the most important discoveries in the history of science were not observed under controlled laboratory conditions. They are what one would call, at the least, preliminary data that set the tableau for hypotheses and replicable testing. Now, Dr. Ansbro, what is your take on this? I mean, to me, it seems like they have evidence of highly advanced craft. They don't know where they're from, how they operate, but they're only willing to go into the direction of extraterrestrial activity, which then leads to the conclusion that they will never find a hint to extraterrestrial activity because we don't know what this looks like. And they leave aside all the other possibilities.
Yeah. Well, even if they successfully, say, capture one of these UAPs and start to analyze it, physically analyze it, I mean, this would be ideal. But there is a problem here. And the problem is you have a dichotomy of knowing how does it operate. And it's probably the worst thing you could do is to even capture one if they are able to capture one. So on the other hand, the approach they're taking at the present time is probably the right approach. That is an astrophysical approach to get data on many, many things, maybe to do with gravity, to do with all sorts of emissions, if any, and such like. So that's the approach I would take, and I would follow the likes of the Galileo project as an example of that.
Yeah, because this is like the recurring theme in all the discussions among scientists about this subject, is that there is a lack of data, right? Now, to me, what was really surprising was that for the first time during this hearing, we heard something more concrete about the actual characteristics of UAPs, because as we all know, there is this security classification guide that prohibits disclosing even the shapes of the objects observed. And Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick actually used the chance during this hearing to present some of the common, the general findings that they've made, like let's say the trend in observations of UAP reports from 1996 through to 2023. And I think this was the most important and interesting part of his whole testimony. Let's have a look.
This chart represents the trend analysis of all the cases in AARO's holdings, right, to date. What you'll see on the left is a histogram of all of our reported sightings as a function of altitude. So most of our sightings occur in the 15 to 25,000 foot range, and that is ultimately because that's where a lot of our aircraft are. On the far right upper corner, you'll see a breakout of the morphologies of all of the UAP that are reported. Over half, about 52% of what's been reported to us are round orb spheres. The rest of those break out into all kinds of different other shapes. The gray box is essentially there's no data on what its shape is. Either it wasn't reported or the sensor did not collect it. The bottom map is a heat map of all reporting areas across the globe that we have available to us. What you'll notice is that there is a heavy, what we call collection bias, both in altitude and in geographic location. That's where all of our sensors exist. That's where our training ranges are. That's where our operational ranges are. That's where all of our platforms are. In the middle, what we have done is reduce the most typically reported UAP characteristics to these fields, mostly round, mostly 1 to 4 meters, white, silver, translucent, metallic, 10,000 to 30,000 feet, with apparent velocities from stationary to Mach 2. No thermal exhausts usually detected. We get intermittent radar returns, we get intermittent radio returns, and we get intermittent thermal signatures. That's what we're looking for and trying to understand what that is.
Now, isn't that fascinating? They, even though they say this is not off-world technology and this is not extraterrestrial or anything that defies the known laws of physics, they look for silverish, whitish, translucent, round, spherical objects that hover stationary, go to Mach 2, and that show no heat signatures from their propulsion system. Dr. Ansbro, you have been looking for UFOs for your whole life. What kind of natural phenomenon could this be?
Okay. Well, after, as you say, most of my life at it, yeah, probably about 33 years, I think, I've researched the area. I think dealing with a different space-time. Now, I'll clarify that. Here we are as physical beings in our space-time in a 3D setting, so to speak. And then when you're dealing with the UAP, it doesn't exactly fit into our space-time with the characteristics that I understand. So I'm suggesting that it's in another space-time, in another reality, that's able to present itself or project itself, even in solid form, to us in our 3D space-time. that's the suggestion I'm making, but I may be completely wrong. And it's interesting, actually, that people over the decades have been saying, well, there's no clear pictures. Well, actually, that would fit in beautifully. If you're in another space-time, it'll be a distortion of the image itself. So when you're applying the astrophysical approach, you have to design instrumentation in a way which doesn't necessarily, how shall I put it? If you were using current conventional instrumentation to determine what the UAP is about, we may have got it wrong. So the first thing actually is to understand what the UAP is doing, the characteristics behind it. And then we may be able to design the instrumentation, to determine further. For example, when we take our normal eyes, we rate at about 30 frames a second or 30 hertz. If you're dealing with video, it's 25, 30 frames a second. Well, it has been shown that if you're using, say, a camera at 10,000 frames a second, you're actually picking up many other things that the eye or the video camera doesn't see. So that's the point I'm trying to make. You have to design the instrument specifically to have some understanding of the UAP characteristics.
And there's this, since you're talking about the limits of perception, there's this other thing that I found really interesting, is that they receive thermal signatures in the shortwave infrared and medium wave infrared spectrum, which is beyond the visible spectrum of man. So that means that whatever's happening is happening in the infrared spectrum. And that reminds me of so many other stories where observations have been made in precisely that same infrared spectrum. For example, on Skinwalker Ranch, most of the observations that they made there was through night vision goggles beyond the 900 or up to 900 nanometer scale, I think, with generation 3 night vision devices. But again, I mean, to the general public, listening to these statements, it looks like they haven't found any proof of ET. Okay, so we don't have to bother with it. We don't have to think about it because they haven't found any sign of ET. But what they're saying here is actually we have these objects that are traveling at Mach 2, which is more than 2,400 kilometers an hour. That's two times the speed of sound. And they register no thermal exhaust, but they have intermittent radar, radio signals, and intermittent thermal signatures, which is also weird because how can, I mean, this kind of contradicts to my general perception. How can something intermit heat waves? If it is hot, then it stays hot. You would have to cool it down. You would heat it up again. You would have to cool it down. But what they're describing is as if they receive heat and then there's no heat and then there's heat again. So there's no cooling down or anything. Isn't that weird?
It could be the output or a byproduct of a power generation system or propulsion system, I suppose.
What do you think, Dr. Ansbro?
Yeah, well, just as I mentioned earlier, I think we're dealing with constructs in a different space-time that are able to manipulate their, how shall I put it, their offering to us in our space-time. And then you have all the other spin-off effects from it, dealing with the thermal side and other emissions and working in the infrared as well. In fact, back in 1976, when instrumented UFO research had been looked into, it was the first time ever that the infrared, how shall I put it, the first UFOs were detected in the infrared, but not in the visible region. This was 1976 in Texas. So the infrared component is really important in this as part of the understanding of the UAP. And then in recent years, some researchers have been applying instrumentation where they're detecting approximately about 10 times the amount of UAPs in the infrared than they are in the visible.
And then there's this whole mystery about pulsed microwave radiation, which also seems to be a common scheme when it comes to UAPs, right? Pulsed microwave radiation is a technology that has been used by the military in secret directed energy weapon technology. We know that, but there are also hints of microwave radiation in places where you wouldn't suspect it, like in the landing in France in Trans-en-Provence. I think it was in the 80s. Where the plant anomalies that were later eventually analyzed in national laboratories showed anomalies in the photosynthesis that the laboratory director could only explain with the effect of pulsed microwave radiation. And that was in 1981. And then think about the Fatima apparition, the Marian apparition of Fatima in 1917. People's garments, clothing were dried when this object flew over them. Some of them reported sunburns. This also sounded like microwave radiation exposure. So is this something that we would see belongs to the UFO phenomenon, just like the apparent superior flight maneuvers and the occurrence in infrared?
Yeah, there's also it's not just the infrared that they emit in, but also when encounters have taken place with human beings, there are some cases where UV radiation has been emitted by the UAP, and the proof of that is actually that people get a tanning effect. You can only receive that tanning if you've got ultraviolet radiation.
And so they're in the ultraviolet and in the infrared, which is the opposite part of the spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ultraviolet. And so this is the visible spectrum. There's ultraviolet, there's infrared, and then there is much more, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this all leads, of course, to the conclusion that we don't know anything about our world. We just perceive this tiny little bit, and what we see with our eyes is just a small excerpt of reality. Isn't that fascinating? We live in a world that is much bigger than what we have thought so far. That's so interesting. And another thing I wanted to point your attention to is something that Dr. Kirkpatrick said, or let's say more precisely, Kirsten Gillibrand said. They said that they have sent whistleblowers to AARO, while AARO is still waiting for approval of their structures, of their operating procedures in order to deal with whistleblower testimony. U.S. Congress sent whistleblowers to them, and Dr. Kirkpatrick said it was about 24 whistleblowers that they have interviewed so far. Did you notice this?
Yeah.
And isn't that fascinating? Because when we talk about whistleblowers, at first we think about the whistleblower provision in the NDAA for fiscal year 2023, which is people that have worked in alleged ultra secret, unacknowledged special access programs dealing with reverse engineering of world craft. So, I mean, isn't that fascinating? And the Daily Mail reported on when was that? On April 26th, that they know that 6 of those 24 whistleblowers claimed they worked on military UFO programs, retrieving and analyzing crash material that have come forward to spill their secrets to senior members of Congress. And this information comes from lawyer Daniel Sheehan, who I do consider a very credible source. Who are the other whistleblowers? Well, we know that certain people who were involved in serious nuclear incidents were interviewed by AARO, for example, Robert Salas, but also Mario Woods, who I interviewed. We know officially that John Burroughs, the military witness from the Rendlesham Forest case in 1980, who was engulfed in this light and then had health problems coming after that, he was also approached by AARO. This is an interesting story, but do you think that anything will ever come to light about what they actually said? You both look skeptical. Dr. Ansbro, you go first.
Yeah, I am skeptical because there's such a dichotomy here of the verbiage that's coming out in the recent the hearings, that it's like when you're dealing with all these whistleblowers coming in, you're dealing with information which I would consider a certain amount of data that provides a huge gap here. And it's actually how to integrate all that into, how shall I put it, probably further Senate hearings where they're trying to sort of keep a lid on the whole thing. And yet most of us around the world that research this area have heard a lot of these whistleblowers over the recent years, particularly Captain Salas.
Yeah, exactly. Paolo, what's your take on this?
Good question. Well, indeed, there are, as Eamon put it, there are so many data coming in, part of which would seem to corroborate what we have heard during the years for really many times concerning the reverse engineering projects on captured UAPs, on things like that. But I mean, I would like to refrain now from expressing any opinion for the moment. The only thing that I would like to remark is that in case the ETH hypothesis is confirmed, and which, by the way, I do agree with you, gentlemen, that it could be just one of the possible explanations for the UAP phenomenon. In case the UAP, the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is confirmed, this is such a huge, monumental, enormous, I cannot find a bigger word for that. I mean, such a huge revelation that will not be given so lightly, not at all, in my opinion. So it will take, personally, I'm convinced that the ETH is the amongst the various solutions is the one which explains most of the UAP characteristics that we know. But in any case, let us remember, it will not be given lightly, not at all, not lightly and not quickly.
That's fascinating because I just, I'm just noticing that we are three people here, and each of us has its own hypothesis, which would be the most probable explanation. Like, you go for the extraterrestrial hypothesis, Dr. Ansbro is the interdimensional hypothesis fanboy, and I'm the crypto-terrestrial fanboy. I think that the fairy and elf stories, I have to say there's something to what Dr. Vallée says, in my opinion. We cannot exclude the possibility that this planet has been habitated by some other species that may be having a look at us. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is, we don't know. None of us knows. And this is so exciting, right? And this is why we are doing all this. So thank you so much for being with me on the show, Dr. Ermin Ansbro and Paolo Guizzardi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
and
Robert.
Also, thank you for watching our show. If you want to find out